Hello. Today we will be in Genesis chapters 18 through 20. It is lesson number 3 in your quarterly. The title of our lesson is Judgment on Evil Cities. And we'll focus in on a few chapters in chapter 18 and 19. And we'll shed light also on chapter 20 toward the end of our lesson today. But we'll focus on what the writers have brought out here in our lesson on page number 19. Once again, if you do not have a quarterly, do not worry. I'll lead you through the lesson today. But if you do, we will be on page number 19. The title, once again, is Judgment on Evil Cities. Lesson number 3, Genesis 18 through 20. Our application for today's lesson is found there on page 19. And by the way, this lesson is dated December 20th of 2020. And our application is what we can glean from this lesson today. We hope we glean many other things, but the writers have brought out here that the student will understand that God's holiness demands judgment on sin. God's holiness demands judgment on sin. Now, the righteous judge, which is Jesus himself, God himself, the righteous judge must judge righteously. What does that mean? That means he will spare the godly and punish the unjust as the righteous judge. 2 Peter 2:9 states, "The Lord knoweth how to deliver the godly out of temptations, and to reserve the unjust unto the day of judgment to be punished." So we must have an understanding of that. The righteous judge must judge righteously. He'll spare the godly and punish the unjust. And we're going to talk about the punishment of Sodom and Gomorrah today. And the story of Lot being there where he shouldn't have been. So let's talk about Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom and Gomorrah was first mentioned in Genesis chapter number 10, verse 19. And they were mentioned in reference to the revolt of the 5 cities that were mentioned there in chapter number 10, verse 19, that revolted against the kings or the rulers in Mesopotamia, which basically owned the land there, if you will, and that area. They were under their rule. These 5 cities get together, these five kings get together and revolt against those rulers of Mesopotamia. It didn't work out too well for them, but they did revolt. Today, Sodom and Gomorrah, along with the other cities here, are believed to be under the Dead Sea. Now that's up under that goes can go with debate. Many people do not believe that. I am under the belief that there's a great possibility that these cities, which have never seen anymore because of the judgment of God, could very well be there in that valley where the Dead Sea is. But that's under much speculation and debate. Won't fall out with you if you believe otherwise, but that is the belief of my belief and belief of many writers here. So these 5 cities there were in that valley, it is believed. Now, in today's lesson, we find that these cities are judged by God. Why? Because of their sin. They're judged because of their sin. We also find that God is patient and long-suffering with the people of his creation. In 2 Peter 3:9, back in 2 Peter again, 2 Peter 3:9 says, "The Lord is not slack concerning his promise, as some men count slackness, but is long-suffering to usward, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance." So, he is the judge, the righteous judge, but he's also long-suffering to his people and patient with us. Now, we begin our lesson today with 3 parts. We're going to begin our focus on chapter 18, verses 20 through 26. The title of that part is A Message from Angels. And then we'll go over to chapter number 19, verses 1 through 7. And the title of that part is A City Intent on Doing Evil. And then we'll finish our lesson today in chapter 19, verses 24 through 26, God's judgment on man's sin. We'll also make point of all the verses in between these, but we'll try to focus on these verses today. So before we get to verses 20 through 26, let's talk about the first part of chapter number 18. In verses 1 through 8, there's some things going on. The Lord appears to Abraham along with 2 angels, and Abraham graciously serves them by preparing a feast. And so that happens in verses 1 through 8. And then in verses 9 through 15, the Lord at this time, during the time of their eating and their conversing with Abraham, the Lord again promises that Sarah will bear a son. And we know that Sarah laughs amongst herself, within herself, because of her age. And then the Lord asked Abraham why Sarah laughed in unbelief. And the Lord, in verse number 14, declares, is anything too hard for the Lord? So the Lord does this. Jesus does this. Ask him, is anything too hard for the Lord? And then once again promises Abraham and Sarah that they will have a son. And then we move on into verses 16 through 19. They take a walk toward Sodom. Jesus and Abram and the two angels. They take a walk toward Sodom, where God reveals his plan of judgment to Abraham. He tells Abraham that Sodom and Gomorrah, we're going down there to check them out, and we'll get to that here in just a moment. But Sodom and Gomorrah is going to be judged. And so he informs Abraham of what's going on. So that's where we are. And now we get to our lesson focus this morning. In the first part, a message from angels, chapter 18, verses 20 through 26. Let's read these verses. And once again, let's see where Holy Spirit leads us today. In verse number 20 of chapter 18, and the Lord said, because the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very grievous. Now this is the Lord and Abraham conversing there as they are making their way toward Sodom, looking toward Sodom. And so the Lord is laying things out for Abraham here. He says, I will go down now and see whether they have done altogether according to the cry of it, which has come unto me, and if not, I will know. And the men turned their faces from thence and went toward Sodom. But Abraham stood yet before the Lord. And Abraham drew near and said, wilt thou also destroy the righteous with the wicked? Peradventure there be 50 righteous within the city. This is Abraham speaking. Wilt thou also destroy and not spare the place for the 50 righteous that are therein? That be far from thee to do after this manner. So slay the righteous with the wicked, and that the righteous should be as the wicked. That be far from thee. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? And the Lord said, if I find in Sodom 50 righteous within the city, then I will spare all the place for their sakes. So in verse number 20, it states that the Lord said, because the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great. This cry is an outcry. It is an outcry that is riotous. It's not a pleasant cry. It is a riotous cry. It is a cry of distress that the Lord is hearing from Sodom and Gomorrah. And he says that this cry that is riotous, that is a cry of distress, is great, meaning there's much of it. It is a very strong cry. There's no speculation about what is going on here. It is real. It is strong. There's a lot of it. And because their sin, it says, because the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very grievous. So this cry is a cry of sin, and it's very grievous. This word grievous means it's heavy. It means it's burdensome. It means it's severe. It also means it's chargeable. This sin, all sin is chargeable. This sin is very chargeable. Now, unlike the sweet-smelling savor of the sacrifices of a faithful nation, the continual cry of the sin of Sodom weighed heavy on the Lord. What a blessing it is to know when they offered sacrifices to the Lord, the faithful nations, it was a sweet-smelling savor, and they were blessed for this. This is a complete opposite of the sweet-smelling savor. There is no worship going on of the Lord here in Sodom and Gomorrah, period. And the cry is not a sweet savor. It is very heavy to the Lord. It is very grievous to the Lord. In verse number 21, we find out that the omniscient God already knew the morals of the citizens. It says here, I will go down and see whether they have done altogether according to the cry of it, which has come unto me. If not, I will know. Well, we know that God is the omniscient God. He knows all things. So he knows the morals of the citizens. Now, one of the writers brought out, and I thought this was pretty interesting, this possibly was said that the judgment was not to be seen as hasty or unwarranted by Abraham or by those around there. God had spoken here. We find in 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 6, and turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemned them with an overflow, making them an ensample unto those that after should live ungodly. So even today should be looking at the judgment that was poured on Sodom and Gomorrah for what was going on in these cities. And we should take note of that. And we should know that God is not going to, He is long suffering and patient, but it runs down and it runs out. And there will become a time of judgment. We know that our world today is much like Sodom and Gomorrah. And God will judge this world. He will judge this world, just like He judged Sodom and Gomorrah, because the people have not looked to Sodom and Gomorrah as an ensample. It was an ensample, but this world is not looking to that. They're not believing that. They're believing their own thing. And so God will judge, and we know these things. So in verse 22, we find out that the story goes on here, and that the two angels make their way towards Sodom, while Abraham and the Lord remains there to continue the conversation. The angels continue on to Sodom to check things out for the Lord, if you will. But Abraham and the Lord stays. They remain. Now, in verse number 23, Abraham drew near and said, "Wilt thou also destroy the righteous with the wicked?" Well, my question is, was there truly any righteous in Sodom? And so Abraham asked this, and he was asking this specifically, I believe, for Lot's sake and his family that's down there. He knew that Lot was, I truly believe Abraham knew Lot was where he didn't need to be. And so he was looking out once again for Lot and his family. So perhaps also Abraham was hopeful that Lot and his family, and perhaps others whom Lot may have had some good influence on, I'm not so sure about that, would be spared the wrath of God. So Abraham's hoping that Lot and his family, and then any others that might be in this city that maybe Lot had influenced, we know that not to be true now, would have been spared. Abraham loved Lot. He was looking out after him. Now, we look down at verses, at the rest of the chapter here. Abraham became, in a way, an intercessor and pleaded for Sodom to be spared if 50 righteous souls could be found. And then he turned it around, trying to bargain with God, if you will. In verses 27 through 32, he goes, if there's 45, if there's 40, if there's 30, if there's 20, if there's 10 righteous, surely you will not judge those righteous with the ungodly. And we do find out in the end of the chapter, in verses 32 through 33, that God graciously agrees to all of Abraham's requests, and then leaves Abraham, and then Abraham returns to his tent. So if we can find 10 righteous, He'll not destroy the righteous with the wicked there. And we move over into chapter number 19, then in our second part. The story's moving along here. It's fixing to get really intense of what happens here in Sodom and Gomorrah. And so this is a city intent on doing evil. This city was intent on doing evil. They had nothing to do with God, period. And in verses 1 through 7 of chapter 19, we'll kind of get an idea of the heart and soul of Sodom and Gomorrah. And there came two angels to Sodom. So these two angels make their way down to Sodom at even, when it's dark. And Lot sat in the gate of Sodom. And Lot, seeing them, rose up to meet them. And he bowed himself with his face toward the ground. And he said, Behold now, my lords, turn in, I pray you, into your servant's house, and tarry all night, and wash your feet, and ye shall rise up early and go on your ways. And they said, Nay, but we will abide in the street all night. And he pressed upon them, this is Lot, he pressed upon them greatly, and they turned in unto him, and entered into his house. And he made them a feast, and he did bake unleavened bread, and they did eat. But before they lay down, the men of the city, even the men of Sodom, compassed the house round, both old and young, all the people from every quarter. And they called unto Lot, and said unto him, Where are the men which came in to thee this night? Bring them out unto us, that we may know them. And Lot went out of the door unto them, and shut the door after him, and said, I pray you, brethren, do not so wickedly. Lot sat at the gate, in verse number 1. This is where it begins. Lot sat at the gate. Now, for men sitting at the gate, these are prominent men, leaders, if you will, of the cities, and they sit at the gate socializing, and they also carrying on business here. They are the leaders of the city. They're carrying on business within themselves and for the city. They're socializing. They're at the gates of the city. So we find out that Lot here is a prominent figure in Sodom here. He's not the king by no stretch of the imagination, but he is prominent. He's sitting at the gate. He's an elderly man with wisdom, if you will, sitting at the gate, socializing, carrying on business here at the city gate. And so he's sitting at the gate, and he sees these two come to him, and he bows toward the ground. He pays respect to these traveling people, these traveling men. And in verse number 2 through 3, Lot encourages them to come into his house to spend the night, and then early in the morning get up and be on your way. You don't want to stay here. That's the kind of the idea I get here. Lot saying, yeah, you need to come into the house. I will give you a place to stay, feed you, but early in the morning, you need to be getting up for the break of the dawn, and you need to be getting out of the city and moving on. You don't need to stay here. There's a reason he was doing that. Well, the angels state that, no, we don't need to do that. We'll be fine. We're going to spend the night in the street. And this is when Lot became very concerned. He urges them to come into his house. And they do. They said, okay, fine, we will come into the house. And Lot serves them a meal and is very respectful to them. He prepares them a meal, and they eat a meal. Now, in verses 4 through 5, we see that they are preparing to lay down for the evening, preparing to go to sleep for the evening, and there's a knock at the door, if you will. Lot's house is surrounded by the men of the city, both young and old. It is surrounded by the men of the city. They want Lot to send the two men that has come into his house. They want Lot to send them out into this mob. And the reason they want to do that is because that we may know them. Now, there is many people today, sinners, lost people, that believe they just wanted to get to know them. They just wanted to get to know them. And that is what that know word can mean, a better knowledge of someone. Now, the aspect or what they truly want to know about these men is what separates everything. They didn't want to know what these men believed. They didn't want to carry on business with these men. They didn't want to know why they were there. That's not what they wanted to know. That's not what they wanted. The context here clearly shows that its meaning of this know is that they wanted to know it had to do with carnal and sexual knowledge. They wanted to know sexually what these men were all about and carnally what these men were all about. Now, I might get turned off here on YouTube or whatever, but that is a fact. This city was full of homosexuals and sodomites, and they wanted to know these men sexually and carnally. You say, well, that's pretty close-minded. Well, if you look over at verses 6 and 7, Lot exits the house. He comes out, and he says, and he urges the men of the city what? Do not so wickedly. Now, if these men outside just wanted to talk, that would about be wicked. Lot realized, and he knew what they wanted. They wanted to do something wickedly, and that was evil. This is more proof that what they wanted to know about the men was carnal, was sinful, and was evil. So, Lot does not want this to happen. And verses 8 through 23, not part of our lesson focus, but we want to point out here what goes on in the rest of this chapter, verses 8 through 23. Lot has an answer for this. And this is how far Lot has gone, if you will, from God. Lot offers his two daughters to this angry mob. Mind-boggling. Instead of offering these two men, that I believe that Lot knew they were messengers of God at this time, he offered his two daughters. And it states there that they were virgins. Now, they were married. We know that they were married, but they were still virgins. So what does that tell you? Once again, carnality. They had not even consummated their marriages. They were still virgins. And Lot was offering his daughters to the mob to satisfy their sexual urges instead of turning the men over to them. What a terrible, terrible thing. He was protecting the guest at the expense of his daughters. But the mob refuses. They don't want the girls. They don't want the women. And they press sore upon Lot's door. They were trying to now make their way into the house to take the men out. So the angels take course. They pull Lot back into the house, shut the door, and they strike the entire mob with blindness. The angels do. And Lot at that time is informed that the city is going to be destroyed. The city is going to be destroyed. Lot is told to gather his family and flee. Get out of the city. It's going to be destroyed. Lot goes out to his sons-in-laws that are no doubt outside the door in the crowd. He tries to convince them this Lot it's going to be, and they laugh at him. They don't have anything to do with Lot. So Lot, the sons-in-law refuse, and the angels literally, if you read that, the angels grab Lot, his two daughters, and his wife, and literally pull them, drag them out of Sodom. They are told to escape to the mountains, but it's funny here that, not really funny, but Lot works a deal, if you will, to flee not to the mountains, but to Zoar, which is basically one of those cities. It's a smaller city, farther south down, but it's one of those cities that was mentioned. So Lot says, I can't make it to the mountains unless I die. I need to go down to this. It's just a small city. I'll go down to Zoar. And the angel said, do whatever you want to do. That's fine. Go ahead. So he makes his way with his family down to Zoar. Now it picks up in verses 20 through 26, God's judgment on man's sin. So let's look at chapter 19, verses 24 through 26, and see what happens. And let's look at 23 right quick. They're talking about in 22 that Abraham and they went down to Zoar. And then 23, the sun was risen upon the earth when Lot entered into Zoar. So when the sun was coming up, that's when the judgment was coming. So as he was entering into this small city, which is south of where Sodom and Gomorrah is, the sun is rising. And in verse 24 through 26 says, then the Lord rained upon Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven. And he overthrew those cities and all the plain and all the inhabitants of the cities and that which grew upon the ground. But his wife looked back from behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. Verses 24 through 25. Sodom and Gomorrah is judged with death of not only the inhabitants of the cities, but the land around them as well. It says there that Sodom upon from the fire, and then verse 25, and overthrew those cities and all the plain and all the inhabitants of cities, and then get this, and that which grew upon the ground. So not only the inhabitants, the people of the city died, were vanished, annihilated, also all of the vegetation around that area was done away with. Verse 26, as they were fleeing, what does Lot's wife do? She looks back. This word look means to scan, look intently at. It wasn't like the look word there is not just a glancing. It's a looking with intently looking at, longing for, if you will. This is what she did. Now in verse number 17, they were told specifically by the angels, Lot, his wife, and his daughters were told specifically not to look back in verse number 17. Yet we see here that Lot's wife looked back. She looked intently at it. She missed it. She scanned it. She was worrying about all those things that she was going to miss, perhaps, from Sodom and Gomorrah, and she became a pillar of salt. Lot's wife was destroyed. She was judged just like the others, and she became a participant in the destruction of the city. Even though she was outside the city, she became part of the judgment because she longed for the city and she looked back. She did exactly what she was told not to do. So she became a pillar of salt. Now it's interesting here that it states here that the vegetation nothing, all this was destroyed. And that is indicative of around the Salt Sea. If you take any pictures around the Salt Sea, nothing lives in the Salt Sea. Nothing lives around the Salt Sea. The only thing that is produced, and now they have, is salt. And that's the only thing that you're getting out from around that area and that whole plain. You have to understand that was along the Jordan River. There was a valley there. The plain, the valley there was lush. That's why Lot went down that way, because it was lush. No longer is that the case. That's why many people believe, me included, that this area where they're talking about is where the Dead Sea is today. There's nothing living there. There's nothing going on there, because God judged those cities that were there in that area. Now, in verses 27 through 38, not part of our focus, but to finalize our lesson today, let's talk about the end of chapter 19. We're going to also talk quickly about chapter number 20. So chapter 20, verses 27 through 38, the influence of Sodom and Gomorrah does not stop here. So Lot and his daughters are now out of Sodom, but they're in Zoar, right? Now, they said, we got to get out of Zoar because this is getting pretty close to us. So he escapes from Zoar, and he does eventually go into the mountains where the angels told him to go in the first place. And him and along with his daughters in a cave, and his daughters are virgins. And now they're wondering about their father's seed being carried on. So they have the great idea of, let's get daddy drunk and let's have sex with him so that we can have children. You don't think for 1 minute that Sodom and Gomorrah was of influence on this family? Even though they were outside the city, they still were influenced by the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah. And these two daughters did something terrible. They got their father drunk, had sex with them, and they had 2 children. Each one of them had boys. The one was Moab, which is the father of the Moabites. And the other was Benami, which is the father of the Ammonites. So the Moabites and the Ammonites, constantly throughout history, haters of God, haters of God's people. And it all started here in the cave with Lot and his daughters. It doesn't stop there. Chapter 20 talks, we get back to Abraham. Chapter 20, interesting story again. Abraham moves. He moves from the area where he is, moving around, probably trying to find place to for all of his cattle and for grazing areas and for food and such. He moves around a little bit. He journeys to Gerar, and once again the king there in Gerar. So what does Abraham do and Sarah? He tells everybody that, and Sarah says, we're brother and sister. This is my sister. So the king takes Sarah. She's once again fair. She's up in age, but she's still fair. Takes Sarah as his wife there. But things start going pretty bad for that king there in that area, a king Abimelech. That's what I was looking for. The king takes Sarah as his wife and is told the truth through a dream by God. So he takes Sarah as his wife, and then God comes to him immediately in a dream and says, look, you're in a bad way. Sarah is married, and you need to not mess with her or touch her or do anything. You need to give her back, or I'm going to kill you. You're going to be judged for this. So immediately this king has this dream, and he goes to and he returns Sarah and silver and animals and all those things to Abraham and says, why are you doing this? And why did you do this to me? So he's done this a few times with Sarah. And we find out in verse number 12 that Sarah and Abraham were half brother, half sister. That's what it says there. They had the same father, but a different mother. So this is where Sarah and Abraham came up with this plan that they've been using for so long. So that's not part of our focus today, but as a history lesson and trying to keep us all going, I wanted to go over the entirety of the lesson here. But we need to get back and focus on what the aim of the lesson was and what the application of the lesson was. It's not a wonderful story, but it's history that we've been talking about. But we have to have an understanding according to what the aim is, and we need to let it sink deep, is we need to understand that God's holiness demands judgment on sin. I hope you have a blessed day, and thank you for being here.